My mother called me a burden my entire childhood. When she got sick and needed a kidney, she found out which daughter was actually compatible. The pediatric ward hummed with its familiar symphony of beeping monitors and whispered conversations when Elena Chen's phone vibrated against her scrub's pocket. She almost ignored it, her gloved hands steady as she adjusted the IV drip for 7-year-old Marcus, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of restless pain. The afternoon light filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the cheerful whale murals she had helped paint during her first year at Children's Memorial. But something about the insistence of the vibration, the way it seemed to pulse with urgency, made her pause. The caller ID displayed a name she hadn't seen in 8 months. Sophie, her younger sister, the one who still sent obligatory holiday texts and birthday wishes that felt more like calendar reminders than genuine connection. Elena's chest tightened as she stepped into the hallway, nodding to her colleague Maria to watch Marcus. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, though Elena would remember it as both an eternity and an instant. Sophie's voice carried that particular tone of crisis management she had perfected over years of being the family spokesperson, the golden child who could deliver bad news with the efficiency of a press release. Margaret Chen, their mother, was in renal failure. Stage 4 chronic kidney disease had progressed faster than expected. The family needed to discuss options. Elena found herself in the supply closet afterward, surrounded by boxes of gauze and sterile equipment, her hands gripping the metal shelving until her knuckles turned white. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, and in those moments of darkness, memories flooded back with visceral clarity. She was 8 years old again, standing in the kitchen doorway as Margaret explained to a neighbor why Elena wasn't in the family Christmas photo. The words had been delivered with such casual cruelty, as if discussing the weather or a recipe ingredient. Elena was going through an awkward phase, Margaret had said, and they wanted the photos to look nice for the holiday cards. The neighbor had laughed uncomfortably, glancing at Elena with pity that burned worse than the exclusion itself. Then she was 12, her report card trembling in her hands as Margaret's voice rose like a tide. A single B+ in advanced mathematics had triggered an hour-long lecture about disappointment and wasted potential. Sophie, 2 years younger, had watched from the stairs, her own straight A report card already magnetized to the refrigerator with the special gold stars Margaret reserved for real achievements. That night, Elena had heard her mother on the phone with Aunt Linda, lamenting the burden of having one child who required so much more effort, so much more patience, so much more everything. The supply closet door opened, bringing Elena back to the present. Maria peered in with concern etched across her features. The kind of genuine worry that Elena had learned to recognize and trust over the years. Without words, Maria understood that something had shifted in Elena's carefully constructed world. She offered to cover the rest of the shift, a gesture that Elena accepted with gratitude that went beyond professional courtesy. The drive home took her through streets that had become her chosen geography, far from the manicured lawns and perfect facades of her childhood suburb. Her apartment building stood like a promise she had made to herself, modest but warm, imperfect but hers. The elevator creaked its familiar welcome as she ascended to the 4th floor, each ding marking another level of separation from the ground, from the past, from the weight that threatened to pull her under.
Inside her apartment, the contrast to her childhood home struck her anew, though she had lived here for 4 years. Where Margaret's house had been a monument to appearances, all sharp edges and surfaces that showed every fingerprint, Elena had created a sanctuary of softness. Plants cascaded from macrame hangers, their leaves catching the late afternoon sun. Mismatched furniture collected from thrift stores and friends' moving sales created a harmony born of comfort rather than coordination. The walls displayed not perfect family portraits, but candid photos of chosen family. David making a ridiculous face at last year's Pride Parade, her therapy group celebrating her 1-year anniversary of setting boundaries, Marcus from the hospital giving a thumbs up after his first successful treatment. She had barely set down her keys when her phone buzzed with David's distinctive notification sound, a snippet of their favorite comedy podcast. His message was simple. Your location showed hospital, then home early. Everything okay? Elena smiled despite the turmoil churning in her chest. She had shared her location with David 2 years ago after a particularly difficult encounter with Margaret at a cousin's wedding had left her dissociating in a parking lot for 3 hours. He had never abused the privilege, only checking when her patterns deviated from normal. A guardian angel with boundaries and respect. 20 minutes later, his key turned in the lock, the sound of true friendship arriving without fanfare. He carried takeout from their favorite Thai place, the aroma of pad see ew and tom yum soup filling the apartment with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. David didn't speak immediately, instead moving through the familiar ritual of their crisis response. Plates from the cabinet above the sink, the good chopsticks from the drawer by the stove, 2 glasses filled with ice, and the fancy sparkling water Elena splurged on during grocery trips. They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, a position that had become their configuration for processing difficult truths. Elena found herself recounting not just Sophie's call, but the avalanche of memories it had triggered. David listened with the skill of someone who had earned his doctorate in psychology, but more importantly, had walked his own path through family trauma. Between bites of noodles and sips of soup, Elena's story unfolded like origami in reverse, each crease revealing another hidden fold of pain. The birthday party where Margaret had given Sophie a new bicycle and Elena a card with a $20 bill, explaining that Elena was harder to shop for. The college acceptance celebration that became Sophie's event, even though Elena had gotten into her dream nursing program the same week. The Christmas morning when Margaret had actually said, in front of extended family, that some children were just born to test their parents' patience. David's presence served as an anchor, his occasional nods and gentle touches to her shoulder, reminding her that she existed in the present, not trapped in the museum of past wounds. When she finished, the sun had set completely, leaving them in the soft glow of the string lights Elena had hung around the living room. Another rebellion against Margaret's harsh overhead fixtures that left no shadow unexposed. The conversation shifted to Elena's therapy journey, the 2 years of intensive work with Dr. Patel that had transformed her from someone who apologized for existing to someone who could name her worth without qualification. They reviewed the techniques like students preparing for an exam: cognitive restructuring, emotional regulation, the STOP method for managing triggers. David reminded her of the breakthrough session where she had finally said out loud that Margaret's treatment was abuse, not tough love, not high standards, not preparing her for a harsh world, but abuse, plain and simple. As the evening deepened, Elena found herself at her window, looking out at the city lights that had become her constellation. Each light represented a life, a story, possibly another adult child of narcissistic parents finding their way through the darkness. David stood beside her, their reflection in the glass showing two survivors who had chosen to thrive. The decision formed slowly, like sediment settling after turbulent water stills. She would go to the hospital. Not for Margaret, not even for Sophie, but for herself. She would go to witness what she had become in the absence of that toxic presence, to measure the distance she had traveled from that 8-year-old girl hidden from family photos. She would go, armored with boundaries and supported by chosen family, no longer the burden Margaret had named her, but the woman she had named herself. That night, Elena performed her rituals of self-care with deliberate attention. The lavender candle she lit filled her bedroom with a scent that had never existed in Margaret's house, where artificial air fresheners masked rather than welcomed. Her meditation practice, 15 minutes of breath work that Dr. Patel had prescribed like medicine, centered her in her body, in her right to exist fully and without apology. The journal entry she wrote was brief but powerful, a declaration of intent rather than a processing of pain. Before sleep, she texted David a simple message: "Thank you for reminding me who I am." His response came immediately: "You remembered. I just held the mirror." The hospital waiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation, a combination that made Elena's stomach clench as she crossed the threshold. 3 years had passed since she'd last seen Sophie in person at their cousin's wedding, where they'd managed exactly 2 sentences of conversation before Sophie had been pulled away by Margaret's manufactured emergency. Now her sister sat in a corner chair, somehow immaculate despite the crisis, her designer handbag placed precisely on the seat beside her like a barrier against the common chaos of public seating. Sophie's head snapped up at Elena's approach, her face cycling through surprise, relief, and something that looked almost like triumph. She rose with the practiced grace of someone who had been taught that appearances mattered, even in moments of collapse. Her cream-colored blazer without a single wrinkle, her makeup applied with the same precision Margaret had always demanded. The embrace she offered felt like a performance, arms positioned correctly but without warmth, a choreographed gesture for an audience that didn't exist. The first words out of Sophie's mouth landed like carefully aimed arrows. She expressed surprise that Elena had finally shown up, emphasizing the word finally, as if Elena had been deliberately delaying rather than arriving within 2 hours of the call. She mentioned how dramatic Elena had always been about the past, how she hoped this crisis would help everyone move forward, how family was family regardless of petty disagreements. Each phrase carried the echo of Margaret's voice, lessons learned so thoroughly that Sophie probably didn't recognize them as anything but her own thoughts. Elena observed her sister with the clinical detachment she had cultivated through months of therapy, recognizing the patterns Dr. Patel had helped her identify. Sophie's words were a masterclass in minimization and gaslighting, reducing years of systematic emotional abuse to drama and petty disagreements. The golden child had learned her role so well that she could perform it without Margaret's direct supervision. A wind-up toy, still spinning long after the key had been removed. Dr. Okafor arrived like a breath of professional neutrality, her white coat and calm demeanor creating a buffer between the sisters. She was younger than Elena had expected,
perhaps early 40s, with natural hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to take in more than just medical information. She guided them to a consultation room, a space designed to contain difficult conversations within walls painted the particular shade of beige that hospitals believed was soothing. The explanation of kidney transplantation unfolded with scientific precision, each detail delivered with careful attention to both medical accuracy and emotional weight. Dr. Okafor emphasized donor autonomy repeatedly, her gaze moving between the sisters as she explained that no one could be coerced, that the decision must be entirely voluntary, that there were protocols in place to protect potential donors from family pressure. Elena noticed how the doctor's eyes lingered on her slightly longer during these explanations, a subtle acknowledgement that medical professionals often recognized family dynamics that went unspoken.
Sophie interrupted halfway through, her voice bright with assumed solution. She volunteered immediately, the words tumbling out with the confidence of someone who had always been the answer to every family problem. She spoke about duty and love, about how she had always been there for Margaret, how this was simply another way to show her devotion. The speech felt rehearsed, as if she had been practicing in the mirror, preparing for her moment of ultimate sacrifice that would cement her position as the good daughter forever. Doctor. Okafor's expression remained professionally neutral as she explained that testing would be needed, that compatibility involved multiple factors, including blood type, tissue matching, and overall health assessment. She scheduled Sophie for immediate preliminary testing, noting that blood type compatibility was the first hurdle and that results would be available within hours. The walk to Margaret's room stretched like a tunnel through time, each step echoing with memories Elena had tried to bury. Sophie led the way with proprietary confidence, pointing out where the good coffee machine was located, which nurses were most helpful, the schedule of Margaret's treatments, as if Elena were a visitor who needed orientation rather than a daughter who had been deliberately excluded. Margaret looked smaller in the hospital bed, but her presence still filled the room with its familiar weight. The illness had carved hollows in her cheeks and painted shadows under her eyes, but her expression remained imperious, a queen merely inconvenienced by temporary circumstances. Her gaze moved past Elena as if she were furniture, focusing instead on Sophie with an intensity that spoke of possession rather than affection. The conversation that followed was a study in deliberate erasure. Margaret spoke about Elena as if she weren't present, telling Sophie to make sure your sister understood the visiting hours, instructing Sophie to explain the situation to your sister if she had questions. Each reference to Elena in the third person was a small violence, a reminder that even in crisis, even when facing mortality, Margaret would not acknowledge her eldest daughter's humanity directly. Elena stood by the window, watching the choreographed interaction between Margaret and Sophie with anthropological interest. She noted how Sophie leaned forward eagerly at each word from Margaret's lips, how she adjusted Margaret's pillows without being asked, how she produced tissues and water and phone chargers with the efficiency of someone who had made anticipating needs her primary identity. The golden child, performing for an audience of one, desperate to maintain her status, even as the kingdom crumbled. 2 hours later, Dr. Okafor returned with results that shattered the carefully constructed narrative. Sophie's blood type was incompatible with Margaret's, a biological fact that couldn't be argued with or manipulated around. The doctor explained it gently but firmly.
Sophie was type A positive. Margaret was type O negative. And while there were many factors in transplant compatibility, this fundamental mismatch meant Sophie could not be a donor. The silence that followed was seismic. Elena watched Margaret's face undergo a transformation she had never witnessed before, the mask slipping completely to reveal raw, primal fear. For perhaps the first time in Elena's memory, Margaret looked vulnerable, mortal, human. Her hands clutched the hospital blanket with white-knuckled desperation, and her breath came in short, panic bursts that the monitors immediately registered. Sophie's reaction was equally revealing. She began speaking rapidly, almost manically, suggesting other relatives who could be tested. Cousins, aunts, distant relations Elena had never heard mentioned before. Anyone and everyone except the obvious candidate standing in the room. Her voice rose in pitch with each suggestion, the perfect daughter suddenly unable to provide the one thing that mattered most. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with trembling fingers, calling out names like an auctioneer desperate to make a sale. Doctor. Okafor waited for the frenzy to subside before speaking again. Her voice carried a different weight as she turned to Elena, noting that preliminary records showed Elena's blood type as O negative, matching Margaret's requirements for that crucial first compatibility marker. She explained that further testing would be needed, tissue typing and cross-matching, psychological evaluation and physical assessment, but the blood type match was a significant first step. The room reorganized itself around this revelation. Margaret's eyes finally found Elena, really looked at her for the first time in years, though the gaze held calculation rather than recognition. Sophie's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine, seeking a winning combination. Disbelief, resentment, fear, and finally, a forced smile that looked like it might crack her face. Elena felt the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders, like a familiar yoke. But this time, she recognized it for what it was. Years of therapy had given her the vocabulary to name what was happening. Emotional manipulation, triangulation, the scapegoat suddenly becoming valuable only for what she could provide. She saw how Sophie's identity was crumbling without her designated role as savior, how Margaret's need was already transforming into entitlement. Doctor. Okafor seemed to sense the undercurrents, suggesting that Elena take time to consider, that donor evaluation was a process that required full informed consent. She provided pamphlets about living donation, mentioned the availability of counseling services specifically for potential donors dealing with complex family dynamics. Her professionalism provided a shield against the pressure already building in the room, like storm clouds. As Elena left the hospital that evening, she carried with her the image of Sophie's face in that moment of revelation, the golden child tarnished by biological impossibility. She thought about how narcissistic family systems created victims of all the children, just in different ways. Sophie had been given conditional love based on performance, taught that her worth existed only in relation to Margaret's needs. The prison of being the favorite was still a prison. The bars just painted gold instead of iron. The phlebotomist needle slipped into Elena's vein with practiced precision, drawing blood that would determine whether her body held the key to her mother's survival. The medical testing suite was sterile and efficient, all white walls and gleaming equipment, but Elena's mind wandered to a different room, Dr. Patel's office, with its warm earth tones and the small fountain that bubbled in the corner. She could almost hear her therapist's voice from 6 months ago explaining how narcissistic parents often viewed their children as extensions of themselves, existing only to serve the parents' needs. The memory crystallized with startling clarity as the fourth vial filled with dark red blood. Dr. Patel had been explaining the concept of narcissistic supply, how some parents fed on their children's achievements, emotions, and very existence like emotional vampires. The irony wasn't lost on Elena now, as her literal blood was being tested to see if she could supply what Margaret needed most. The metaphor had become flesh, the psychological made physiological.
Between the blood draw and the tissue typing appointment, Elena's phone buzzed with messages from Sophie that escalated in frequency and desperation. The first few maintained a veneer of politeness, asking how the testing was going, mentioning how much it would mean to everyone if Elena could help. But as the hours passed, the messages revealed their true purpose, each one a carefully crafted manipulation delivered as Margaret's proxy. Sophie wrote about how Margaret had been asking about Elena's life, showing sudden interest in her nursing career, her apartment, whether she was dating anyone. These details, withheld for years like weapons, were now being offered as bait, the promise of maternal attention that Elena had craved as a child but learned to live without as an adult. Sophie mentioned that Margaret had been crying, actually crying, saying she regretted the distance between them, that she wanted to make things right. The tissue typing procedure required Elena to sit still for an hour while technicians processed her samples in an adjacent lab. She used the time to practice the grounding exercises Dr. Patel had taught her, feeling her feet on the floor, naming 5 things she could see, 4 she could hear, 3 she could touch. The hospital sounds became an anchor to the present, preventing her from drowning in the undertow of past wounds that Sophie's messages had stirred. Another memory surfaced, this one from a group therapy session where she'd learned about false apologies. The facilitator had explained how abusers often offered apologies without accountability, vague expressions of regret that avoided naming specific harmful actions. They would say they were sorry for whatever they might have done, sorry if you felt hurt, sorry things were difficult, but never sorry for the specific cruelties they had inflicted. These non-apologies were designed to make the victim feel obligated to forgive without the abuser having to acknowledge or change their behavior. Sophie's next message contained exactly such an apology, supposedly from Margaret, but filtered through Sophie's typing. Margaret was sorry if there had been misunderstandings, sorry if Elena had felt overlooked, sorry that they had grown apart, not sorry for calling her a burden, not sorry for excluding her from family photos, not sorry for the 1,000 cuts that had left Elena bleeding internally for years. The message ended with promises of change, of being a better mother, of making up for lost time, all contingent on Elena coming through when the family needed her most. Doctor. Okafor entered the waiting room with an expression that told Elena everything before words were spoken. The compatibility was perfect, better than most biological matches they saw. Her tissue markers aligned with Margaret's like puzzle pieces designed to fit together. Her kidney function test showed she could safely donate. Her psychological evaluation had cleared her as capable of making an informed decision. She was, in medical terms, an ideal donor. That evening, David arrived at Elena's apartment with Thai food and his laptop, ready for what they had planned as a processing session. But Elena had a different request. one that surprised them both with its clarity and purpose. She wanted to role-play the conversation with Margaret, to practice maintaining boundaries while navigating the manipulation she knew was coming. David's psychology training made him the perfect scene partner for this emotional rehearsal. They sat across from each other at Elena's small dining table, the one she'd rescued from a sidewalk and restored with her own hands. David channeled Margaret with unsettling accuracy, having heard enough stories to understand her patterns. He began with guilt, mentioning how a mother should be able to rely on her children, how family was supposed to come through in times of crisis. Elena practiced her response, calmly stating that family relationships required mutual respect and care, not just one-sided obligation. David escalated to emotional manipulation, fake tears, and declarations of love that had never been expressed before. Elena named the tactic out loud, saying she recognized the sudden affection as transactional, tied to need rather than genuine feeling. They continued through the catalog of narcissistic strategies: rage when boundaries were maintained, bargaining with hollow promises, playing the victim, threatening self-harm, attempting to triangulate through Sophie. After 2 hours of practice, Elena felt armored with clarity. She wasn't going into battle, but into truth-telling, not to wound, but to stand firm in reality. David hugged her before leaving, reminding her that she could walk away at any time, that she owed nothing to anyone except herself. The next morning, Elena entered Margaret's hospital room alone, having asked Sophie to give them privacy. Margaret looked smaller still, the disease eating away at her physical presence, but her eyes remained sharp with calculation. For the first time in years, they were alone together. No Sophie to mediate or perform for, no relatives to maintain appearances around. Margaret began immediately with the script Elena had anticipated, expressing regret about their estrangement, claiming she had always loved Elena, but hadn't known how to show it. Elena let her speak without interruption, noting how Margaret's version of history had been revised to cast herself as a struggling mother who had done her best, rather than an abuser who had systematically destroyed her daughter's sense of self. When Margaret paused, expecting Elena to rush in with forgiveness and reassurance, Elena instead began naming what she observed. She identified the minimization, the way Margaret was reducing years of cruelty to communication problems. She pointed out the lack of specific acknowledgement, how Margaret wouldn't name actual incidents of harm. She called out the timing, how this sudden desire for connection coincided precisely with Margaret's need for a kidney. Margaret's mask slipped, revealing anger that flashed like lightning before being quickly suppressed. She tried another approach, mentioning her own difficult childhood, how her mother had been cold and critical, how she had sworn to be different but had fallen into patterns she couldn't control. This revelation might have devastated Elena years ago, the glimpse of vulnerability, the suggestion of intergenerational trauma. But Elena had done her own work, understood that explanation wasn't excuse, that understanding origins didn't obligate her to accept abuse. She acknowledged Margaret's pain while maintaining that it didn't justify passing that pain to her own children. She spoke about cycles that could be broken, choices that could be made, accountability that could be taken even late in life. The conversation reached its crucial point when Elena stated her terms with clinical precision. She would consider donation, but only if Margaret entered family therapy, not just individual counseling, but sessions where the abuse would be acknowledged and addressed. She required Margaret to write a letter taking specific accountability for specific actions, not vague regrets, but concrete acknowledgement of harm. She wanted Sophie included in the therapy, for the golden child dynamic to be examined and dismantled. Margaret's response was volcanic, though confined to words rather than physical violence by her weakened state. She called Elena manipulative, accused her of taking advantage of a dying woman, said she was proving herself to be exactly the burden Margaret had always known she was. The words that had once devastated Elena now revealed themselves as the desperate flailing of someone losing control. Sophie burst through the door at the sound of raised voices, her face flushed with panic. She tried to mediate, to smooth over, to return everyone to their assigned roles. But Margaret, in her rage and desperation, turned on Sophie too, demanding she convince her ungrateful burden of a sister to do the right thing. The words hung in the air like a revelation, Margaret calling Elena a burden, even while needing her kidney to survive. Sophie's face underwent a transformation Elena had never seen before. Confusion and recognition warring across her features. For perhaps the first time, she was seeing Margaret not as the mother who had favored her, but as the woman who could destroy one daughter while claiming to love another. The golden child's pedestal was revealed as a prison of its own. Conditional love that could be withdrawn the moment Sophie failed to deliver what Margaret needed. Doctor. Okafor arrived for rounds, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere. She asked to speak with Elena privately, guiding her to a consultation room where she gently but firmly reminded Elena that donation was entirely voluntary, that there were protocols to protect donors from coercion. She mentioned that the hospital had counselors specifically trained in transplant ethics and family dynamics, offering to arrange a session immediately. Elena appreciated the support, but didn't need it to make her decision. The choice had crystallized during Margaret's rage, not as revenge, but as clarity. She would donate her kidney, not from obligation or guilt or even hope for relationship repair. She would donate from her own compassion, the empathy that Margaret had tried to beat out of her, but had only grown stronger. She would donate to prove to herself that she was not the burden Margaret had named her, but the strongest member of a broken family. The pre-surgery preparation began 2 weeks later, after Margaret had reluctantly agreed to therapy and written a letter that fell short of full accountability, but represented more honesty than she had ever offered before. Elena prepared her body and mind with equal attention, following the medical protocols while maintaining her emotional boundaries. The night before surgery, Elena's apartment filled with chosen family. David was there, of course, but also Maria from work, her therapy group members, even Marcus's mother, who had become a friend during the long nights of his treatment. They didn't talk about Margaret or obligation or family dysfunction. They talked about love that was freely given, support that didn't require transaction, the families we create when the ones we're born into fail us. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Margaret faced the consequences of her choices in solitude, broken only by Sophie's increasingly distant visits. Sophie had begun her own therapy, started questioning the narrative she had been fed since birth, wondering who she might have been without the golden child role that had defined and confined her. The morning of surgery arrived with unusual clarity, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to promise something beyond the procedure itself. Elena walked into the hospital, not as the burden returning to serve, but as a woman who had chosen compassion despite cruelty, who had found strength in what was meant to break her. She was wheeled into surgery, surrounded by the medical team she trusted, while Margaret was prepared in another room, attended by professionals, but not by the love she had never learned to cultivate. The possibility of healing hung in the sterile air between the operating rooms. Not the fairy tale reconciliation Margaret might have imagined, but something more real and more difficult. It was the possibility that cycles could be broken, that Sophie might find her own identity beyond the golden child role, that Margaret might glimpse the damage she had done in time to prevent further harm. It was the possibility that Elena's kidney would give Margaret not just more years of life, but a chance to learn what living really meant. As the anesthesia took hold, Elena's last conscious thought was not of Margaret or obligation or the surgery itself. It was of the plants in her apartment that David would water, the chosen family waiting in the recovery room, the life she had built from the rubble of her childhood. She had proven what Margaret never believed, that she was not a burden, but a gift, one that she could choose to give or withhold, one that came from strength rather than weakness. The surgery would be successful, the kidney would function, Margaret would live. But the real transformation had already occurred in that hospital room, where Elena had named the truth, where Sophie had seen behind the mask, where Margaret had been forced to confront the reality that the daughter she had called a burden was the one who held the power to save her. The healing that mattered most had already begun, not in the operating room, but in the choice to donate from compassion rather than compulsion, to give life while maintaining boundaries, to prove that love could exist even where it had never been nurtured.